I am going to introduce our next panelist and our moderator. So our next panel is our Provincial Life Sciences Policy Panel 2018 and beyond. I'm really excited about this panel. I'm very appreciative of the province coming here today and representing with two assistant deputy ministers that I have a great deal of respect for and have worked with in my past life at government, and are, as I said previously, as committed to growing life sciences in Ontario as all of us are, and they really are internal champions for us. Our moderator is Sabina Steinkellner, who's the Chief Commercial Officer of Sanofi Pasteur Limited, and it's the Canadian Vaccine Division of Sanofi. She has more than 12 years experience at Sanofi, and Sabina has recently joined the board of Life Sciences Ontario, and we are really pleased to have her here today to moderate this panel with Greg Wootton and John Marshall from the province. So Sabina, with that, I'll ask you to please come to the podium.
Thank you very much, Jason. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. So good morning, everyone. I am really honored to be part of the LSO board and to be moderating this panel this morning. I'd like to start by giving a brief introduction of our two esteemed panelists. Jason said a little bit about them, and I think you do have their bios as well. So I'm going to be brief, but we'll start with Greg Wootton. So Greg Wootton is the Assistant Deputy Minister of Research, Science and Strategy Division in the Ministry of Economic Development and Growth and the Ministry of Research, Innovation and Science. Greg is responsible for the oversight of Ontario's investments in research and innovation through programs such as the Ontario Research Fund and Early Researchers Awards. So with that, I'd like to welcome Greg Wootton to the stage, to the panel desk. Our second panel member is John Marshall. John Marshall is the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Commercialization and Scale-Ups Division. He is serving both the Ministry of Economic Development and Growth and the Ministry of Research, Innovation and Science. Under John's leadership, the Commercialization and Scale-Ups Division, CSU, is responsible for working with Ontario companies and delivering partners to build a strong entrepreneurial ecosystem that provides entrepreneurs and startups, including social enterprises, with the supports and services they need to execute on their business strategy and to access capital markets. And with that, I'd like to welcome John Marshall up to the panel desk. So just to give you an idea of our format this morning, our panel members do not have slides this morning. I'm going to introduce sort of the general topic, and then they will each have about 5 minutes. We might give them a little bit more if they are really, really interesting. No, I'm kidding. We will give them more if they want it, to share their insights around that topic. I then have the opportunity to ask them a few questions. And as Jason mentioned, I think we want some really, exciting discussion here. So hopefully they will enjoy my questions. And finally, we will end with a Q&A. So we should have about 10 minutes, 15 minutes to open up the Q&A to the room. Okay? So, regardless of the outcome of the next provincial election, the Ontario Public Service will continue to work towards growing Ontario's life sciences sector. What are the key priorities for the OPS leading up to the election, and how do these align with the LSO blueprint presented by Jason this morning? Maybe Greg, we'll start with you.
Certainly. First off, good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation here. I certainly do appreciate the opportunity to address folks here. Maybe what I would do is kind of lay a little bit of groundwork, and I think John may do something similar around some of the things that we've done thus far, especially over the past year, and maybe give you a little insight into some of the other things that we've been working on that are related to the life sciences field. So probably top of mind for most people is the announcement that was made 2 weeks ago about the announcement around our chief scientist, Dr. Molly Shottet. We are very excited about getting Molly started and as taking on that role. The shorthand we tend to use as far as the role for the chief scientist is both policy for science and science for policy. And I could spend the rest of my time just talking about that. But we have been doing a number of other things as well. The Life Sciences Working Group is very active. It was activated early last year, early in 2017. And we are at a point where we're very close to having some output soon. And we are very excited about that as well, some of the work that's happening there. The other thing that you may be aware of, there was, I wouldn't say an announcement, but it was made public a few weeks ago around the Ontario Research Fund and the review. This was part of Minister Moridy's mandate letter of last year. So we have sort of waited until we got the Naylor report out before we took a look at our research funds, but that is now well underway, and that group is starting to take a look at not just the Ontario Research Fund, but also the Early Researcher Awards. And so we're taking, so that work's going on. We've got two distinguished chairs, actually. Dr. Elizabeth Cannon from the University of Calgary and is a co-chair, as is Dr. Benny Geiger from the Weizmann Institute in Israel. So we feel quite pleased with the participants we have on that front. I think it's also maybe worthwhile to kind of point out some of the other things that are happening that you might not be aware of. They're not in the news per se as government activities, but certainly things that we're doing. And these certainly have connections to life sciences, but they're not specific to life sciences. So, for example, we have been working on an IP strategy. As Jason was mentioning, that is something that we need to take a look at. And that's being driven from a couple of fronts. First off, IP has been identified as one of the things as part of the NAFTA negotiations. So that's certainly driving some of that. As well, you'll recall in the federal budget of this spring, the federal government announced a review of their IP policy. And given that IP is the domain of the federal government, we're certainly watching that very closely and trying to provide some input to that. I would also add to that, to the IP, it's not just patents, it's not just licensing, et cetera, but we're also taking a look at the value of data. And I think there's a very close connection to the life sciences in that it's one of the assets we might actually have from our healthcare system, and government is turning their attention to how do we better use some of the data that we may have available. So that's going on. We are working on as well on the cannabis front. That is together with the Ministry of the Attorney General, who actually has lead on that file. But also there are a number of ministries that are involved in this. We are working closely with the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, OMAFRA. Again, that's a plant, life sciences, looking not just at the recreational side, but also the medical uses as well. We're also doing work on clean tech, and there are obvious connections to life sciences in there, whether it's bioindustrials, biofuels. We're even seeing the application of biotechnologies to remediation and cleanups, et cetera. So that is certainly a part of that. I made a brief mention of NAFTA, but we're doing a lot of work in that, and there will be implications, obviously, for the life sciences sector on what comes of NAFTA, if NAFTA even exists, depending on what you believe when you read in the press. But there's lots of work going on in that area. And also, we're doing a lot of work in what we refer to as transformative technologies. And this is very broad. It includes not just those technologies which you could easily assign to the life sciences sector, such as genomics, regenerative medicine, et cetera, but it also includes what I would supportive technologies, whether that be AI, data, deep learning, et cetera. We're increasingly seeing these technologies being applied to a host of sectors, I guess you could call, say, more broadly speaking. And maybe that's where I'll kind of, so I should have said actually on the clean tech front, we're working with the Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change. They actually have kind of, they are our co-partners on that front. NAFTA is being led by the Ministry of International Trade. Transformative Technologies is really kind of a broad initiative. And circling back to the chief scientist, they are being given an all-of-government mandate. So I think that's really kind of key stuff. The last thing I'll maybe say before I turn to my colleague John here is, I just want to pick up on one of Jason's comments about the timing. And it is very interesting time, and I think John might speak to some of where we've come from. Jason mentioned about being patient. A lot of, from the government perspective, we have made significant investments in the research and the science, particularly the past decade, and we're really starting to see the fruits of that now. It takes a while. Some might say it's taken a decade to kind of see this growth. And so we're really trying to, what's the next decade look like? And where do we want to be 5-10 years out? And what are the milestones on the way to that? So we are trying to take a forward-looking approach to this. But again, back to Jason's comments about timing, life gets very interesting for civil servants as we lead up to an election, but it's also a very exciting time in that it's where a lot of ideas are brought forward, where a lot of ideas that have been bubbling in the background have an opportunity to see the light of day, because there is an appetite for new ideas. There's an appetite to understand what is possible, because if you think about it, an election is really looking forward. Who do you, what do you envision for yourself, whether you're representing an industry or whether you're a private citizen? What do you envision for yourself for the next 4 to 5 years? So an election is all about looking forward, and that's why it's, in some ways, it's a very hectic time to be a civil servant, but it's also a very exciting time to be a civil servant. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Thanks, Gordon. So I thought about this presentation one way, and then I read the blueprint report last night, and so I totally redid what I was thinking about saying. So I thought I'd actually just go through the recommendations. I mean, I think that's probably the most helpful thing, and to give you a sense of what we're doing. So when you talk about promoting the life sciences sector in Ontario as open for business, which ironically was my previous division, I mean, I think the one thing I'd like to chat about in that phase is the whole one review. And so we are right now doing a comprehensive review of our Ontario network of entrepreneurs. There are 130 organizations in that network. I mean, we've built one of the most successful commercialization networks, I think, in the world. I think we are second only to California in the number of startups that we create. And I think that the network is really gaining a lot of traction. Funny, when I speak to Ian Klugman at Communitech, Ian tells me that 40% of the startups coming into Communitech are actually focused on healthcare. And why is that? Because healthcare is a market, right? And these are entrepreneurs trying to find markets and markets for their ideas. And then I was at the Halton, the Haltech, Rick, and I was quite surprised at how focused Halton is around healthcare and health technologies, to the point, like examples like Cloud DX came out of a ER doc who was tired of looking at the way that the system worked and people being in hallways and et cetera, et cetera. And when you look at like Think Research, and when you look at a lot of the technologies that are coming, I think there is a lot coming out of the network that relates to the life sciences sector. The second recommendation in the report was around access to capital. And so Steve Romanishin's here, I saw Brenda here. We've done a lot around access to capital. It's been successful, it's generated returns. It was pretty crickets when you went out there in 2008 trying to raise capital following the financial crisis. I always just say, people, it's a good thing my feet are longer than my nose, so that I wouldn't get when they slammed the door in my face, I wouldn't get hurt. So we actually went and created. I think we're now at $3.4 billion in terms of capital in this country, and it's been a huge success. The funds that we invest in, that Steve and Brenda now manage, are generating 46% increase in staffing year over year. I mean, the average company growth is around 6% employment, and they're generating 46%. So I think it's quite incredible. There is a lot of work, and I know if Minister Moridi was here, he would say that he has a focus on a big life sciences fund. So I think that LSO's blueprint direction around that is pretty much aligned. And I think that actually, to the point around pension capital, I think that two things are going on. One is pensions saw returns. I mean, the pension plans, OMERS was in OVCF, and others were in NVCF and others. They're actually seeing the effect of innovation and technology change on them and their business model. So I do believe that we are going to see more and more pension plans come into the pension system. I think OPT, I think I'm right, or OPB came into NVCF. So, it's great to see people like Hugh O'Reilly and others out there in the market talking about venture and innovation as a model. In terms of the growing our talent, I kind of bundle that under the work we're doing on our scale-up strategy. And Jason's a member on the Leadership Council. Rafi was attending a session we had yesterday around market access. So that work is actually 6 pillars: intellectual property, procurement, market access, access to capital, talent, and regulatory modernization. So we're actually going at each of those pillars to see what is it that we actually have to do to help Ontario companies scale up, because we've got a great pipeline of startups, and the issue isn't the company in a life sciences fund. We kind of think of a company that gets 5 to 10 million of third-party capital as being at a scale-up stage. What is it to take that company to get 20, 30, $50 million? And we've had successes in, Zymeworks. We've had successes in Profound, in the market, and others. And I think the key is, how do we actually have more of that? And how do we address the talent gaps? How do we use government through our procurement policies? What do we do with the Federal Accelerated Growth Services and our own Ontario Investment Office? So this strategy is actually aimed at trying to pull together. I'm an action-oriented person, so I'd like to see 2 or 3 key programs coming out of each of those pillars that will really tip the needle. As our deputy says, how do we make our fast grow faster? 2 other things I'd like to kind of chat about that we've actually launched that people may not be aware of, and it comes back to the whole procurement piece. One is we launched a thing called a Small Business Innovation Challenge, or SBIC. And that's really around the government. It's a cultural thing where governments are beginning to realize that we aren't just a taxer and a spender, but we're actually a market. And so we launched 2 challenges. And so it's, we curate these challenges inside governments. Governments always think, my email doesn't work, or the server's slow. Well, that's really not a challenge you can go to the market with. So the first one was around digital identity. How do we know who you are? How do we know you are who you are when you actually come in and try to get your grant or whatever? And how do we actually validate your identity on an ongoing basis across multiple platforms? And the second one we did was around HOV lanes. How do we know there's 2 people in the car, not a person and a dog? How do we know you when you come into the lane? And how do we not have you need a transponder? So these are challenges where we're implementing things like HOV lanes or digital identity, and we want the market to actually come back with that solution. Just recently, it's not really kind of launched, but it's kind of out there. we announced the next 2 challenges, and that was actually around cannabis detection for impaired driving, and the second one was around sales suppression. I guess the people skim revenues off their, when you go in and they don't actually report all of their sales revenue when you go to a retailer. So what are the technologies that actually help us deal with that? So what this is about is, and we've got Elections Ontario, I've got, Bill Chernetsky working on one, I've got another one in the Ministry of Health involving, ambulances. So we're actually having ministries now come forward to say, hey, this works. Like at the first aspect we had, 150 companies came for each of the challenges. And what was interesting was we gave them 1 minute apiece to actually, say what your business was, and everyone had a number. And in the room, people go, what number were you and what number were you? And what it caused was we actually had consortia together. So 49 companies applied for those 2 programs, and 17 companies were selected. And no individual company, like SecureKey, for those of us that paid our taxes this year, you would have used SecureKey to actually go in and validate that you use BMO as your bank to go into CRA. Well, even SecureKey didn't have the whole solution around the HOV lanes, or around the digital identity. So, they had to go into a consortium as well. So it's a great program around how we're changing the culture of ministries to realize that the market can actually be part of the solution. The second thing I'd like to chat about is our Scale Up voucher. So it's a $32.4 million program to really help give companies the tools that they need to scale up. So we, and we didn't put any strings on the voucher. You can hire a CMO, you can open an office in Germany, you can buy a CRM system, you can deal with IT. What is it that you need to actually scale up? So, and we didn't just, it isn't about money. Actually, what we did was we gave each of the companies a growth coach. So 60 coaches have been deployed across 60 different companies. 19 vouchers have been awarded. The average revenue of those companies, interesting, is $8.7 million, and the average number of employees is 65. So these are companies that are at that inflection point that are looking to scale up. In the next quarter, we have 22 coaches on tap. We have 6 growth plans, and we're in the pipeline of 5 more vouchers. So this is real money going out to companies. And interesting, when the program was launched, I thought that the voucher wasn't targeted enough. So the original market was between $1 million and $50 million, and I said, that's way too broad a pipeline. So we modified it. 3 months into a program, 2 rounds of a voucher in. So it's now $1 million voucher, not a $250,000 voucher. So $1 million voucher to a company to do whatever you want to accelerate your growth plan is huge. And so that's like an A round of capital. And so we modified the voucher to be, no, you've got to be $5 million in revenue. And for a life sciences fund, you have to have raised $10 million in third-party capital, because life sciences companies are often pre-revenue. And the $50 million is ridiculous, so we made it between $5 and $25 million. So, these are examples of programs that we're launching, and I think Bill Chernetsky's here in the room and some of the folks from Excite. But, the other part, to come back to the procurement part, is, there's the Excite board, and that's a board that I sit on, where we're really trying to actually help companies get through that, the morass of government rules and regulations to help actually get those technologies. And the most recent announcement around sleep apnea as the first Ontario company to actually punch through that system. So I hope I addressed the 4 pillars. It wasn't what I anticipated doing, but when I read the blueprint last night, I thought I might as well go right at it and tell you what we're doing.
Thank you very much to both of you. So I'm going to start with, I think, a relatively long question, but life sciences is often listed as a priority sector. I think both of you have talked about that. Jason spoke about that, obviously. And we do see significant investments by the province into fundamental research, accelerators such as MARS, commercialization programs such as Excite, which you mentioned as well, John. At the same time, the sector is often underrepresented in economic development programs. Recently, and I think we talked about this a little bit this morning in terms of the superclusters, the sector was notably absent in the federal supercluster initiative. So Does the government truly see life sciences as a priority economic opportunity? Or is it really just a large cost line on the provincial budget? How can this sector better articulate its value proposition to government?
Sure, sure. Maybe a few things just off the top. Yes, it is a priority sector. I can say unequivocally, the Minister Moridi particularly is very taken with the life sciences sector and is very interested in seeing it grow and develop. We have put a lot of time, effort, money into the life sciences sector, particularly as noted in the question in the fundamental science, the research part of it, and the commercialization. But I'd also suggest that part of that is simply, as I noted before, kind of the growth stage. So we are looking at the next 10 years and what does that look like. There was reference to some of being underrepresented in some of the economic development programs. I can assure you that's not because by design. We've actually tried to ensure that there are opportunities for life sciences in the economic development programs. But we've had a long-standing challenge in finding or seeing the opportunities come forward. I'm a bit of an old hand at economic development programs, and I think back to the BIP program of, that's probably 12 years ago now or so. And it eventually got rolled into what then became the Strategic Jobs and Investment Program, or funds, SGIF. But largely because it got rolled in because there was really no uptake. We just couldn't find the projects, if you will, to do that sort of thing. I think I'm hopeful that over the next several years that we will see a greater take up by life sciences companies in those programs. In fact, I think we're already starting to see it. I know recently, and both John and I sit on committees that look at the projects that come forward for not just the Jobs and Prosperity Fund, but some of the regional programs as well. And you're starting to see more life sciences-based programs. Now, a lot of them are in the agricultural sector or food or other areas, not necessarily health, but we are starting to see more in the life sciences. We're also starting to see where I think there's opportunities as well is where projects where it's life sciences, but it involves physical sciences or data sciences types of things. And that's actually, I think, one of the challenges that government is having right now is where do some of these things start and end? Even trying to define life sciences anymore is becoming more and more challenging. And I can give you examples. One project that comes to mind that we looked at recently, better packaging of spinach. And it was all about sensors on the line. So instead of having people with hair nets standing there picking out the spinach leaves that were looking like they had been bruised or otherwise had deformities, whatever, because those are the ones that start to go bad first. The leaves give off a chemical signature. So there's the life sciences part of it, the biology of how that occurs and what that chemical signature is. The physical science is how do we detect that on a very fast-moving assembly line, basically, or a packaging line. But that technology is being installed as we sit here and speak with government support. And what that will do is extend the life of the spinach on your shelf. It may seem a minor thing, but I use it as an example of, is that agriculture? Is that chemical sciences? Is that physical sciences, production? Is that life sciences? Where do you draw the lines on these types of things? It's one of the challenges that we're certainly trying to grapple with. The last thing I'll say, and maybe John will want to speak to this a bit as well, I must admit, at least personally, and I know a lot of my colleagues within the ministries, our eyebrows went up when we saw the short list that came out in the supercluster and the absence of any sort of life sciences. I don't think I was alone on that. I think a lot of people were that way. But as per Jason's comments, I am hopeful that that the federal government is looking at alternatives. They have other, they're looking at this very broadly, and I think it certainly is true that the superclusters are not the only opportunities for the various consortia that came together, came forward.
I was going to joke with Greg, maybe the reason that BIP didn't work was the director that ran it, but that's another story anyway. I think that, first of all, I sit in an office, and many of you will know that as people in my the previous role, people like Tim McTiernan and George Ross and others, right? And it's, Greg and I sit in positions and in work that's quite frankly a privilege to do. But when I look back at the last, when I came to the ministry in 2003, we have made some foundational investments, mainly on Greg's side, things like OICR and CCRM and others, Mount Sinai, Sunnybrook, Sick Kids. I remember the, year ends used to be like Christmas. We'd have VP's research all lined up on March 28th to get their checks, et cetera. But those were foundational investments. And then most recently, we made another round of foundational investments around AI and quantum and 5G, et cetera. So what I now really see, and I think life sciences is vitally important. And it's actually not because Greg and I say it's important. It's actually because the market's saying it's important. So what I see is a real convergence around big data, around the fundamental science that we've invested in, like Michael May at CCRM. The users, when you think about Think Research, right? They're emerging because users don't care about our privacy laws. Users say, I don't want to go to Mount Sinai and then go across the road to Sunnybrook and them not know that I was at the other one, right? They want the user is going to define that. And then I think about revenue, right? And so I think that, whenever there's great science and there's a market and there's a user and there's something that differentiates us like big data or whatever, it's only in the upside. And I think we've seen it. I mean, when I started in this file, life sciences revenue was, the IRR in a life sciences fund was what, minus something? I don't know, right? It's now what, 14.5%. Compound IRR. For now, actually, life sciences, I joke with Peter Vandervelde and Damien, it's a 14-year overnight success story, right? But it took 14 years of investment by people like, Minister Premier McGuinty and Minister Wilkinson and Minister Malloy and others and Minister Moridi to actually get us to where we are today. And now we're actually at this beautiful moment where we have markets, users, data, and it's all coming together and sensors, et cetera. So, it's a huge priority because we have a huge competitive advantage, right? When you look at Ontario and when you look at what we're about, people talk about the single payer, and we actually haven't capitalized that at all, I don't think, because we actually haven't actually opened our markets, but the market's going to open itself. The user is going to define that. There's going to be more Think Research, there's going to be more cloud DXs, and there's going to be more data and more answers. So I actually think it's going to become it is a huge priority, has been a huge priority with some huge investments over the years and will continue.
Thank you very much. So it sounds like there is a lot going on, a lot of exciting movement. Why do we not see that made in Canada global success, made in Ontario global success story? And I think Jason talked about collaboration. Is there a greater role for government in making that possible? Do you see us sort of on the precipice of that? What do you think needs to happen to make it possible?
Is there a big compound or a big vaccine sitting there waiting on the wings? I don't know. I'm not in the labs. I'm not there. But I think there's a big market, and I think that we're going to see some of these companies punch through. I think about how long Damien and Kelly have been at Genesis trying to make a buck, and they're finally actually making some money and having some between EPOCAL and whatever, they're actually making some real money. And now actually, it was really easy for them to raise their second fund. So I actually do think that it's going to get there. I think that the federal government hopefully will announce their VCAP 2 soon. We'll get some more money in the market. I know that Steve and Brenda, who are here, are very active in terms of what we're doing on the access to capital side. So I think we will get there.
I tend to agree with John. I think we're actually at a point where, the big companies, if you will, the global biotech success stories are out there now, and more to come. Our deputy kind of has said you almost need to look at this in 10-year-long segments. We've been through 10 years of doing the science. We're now in kind of the growth stage and further down the road. But I'll maybe address the role for government part. And the traditional role for government is if there's a market failure or if there are barriers, et cetera, that's where governments tend to jump in. We certainly are looking at and trying to ensure that there aren't barriers. And it goes back to some of the stuff that I mentioned before that we are currently looking at. So IP, I think, is going to be a big question. Because one of the things that, as much as I'm confident the next success story is out there, we're concerned about the stickiness of that, to keeping that in Ontario, keeping the economic benefits of that in Ontario. Do we fool ourselves into thinking that 100% of it's going to stay here? No, but if we can get our fair share, I think that's where we want to be. And that includes things like IP. It includes things like talent as well. Is this a place where those leaders of those companies want to build a business, et cetera? So there's a lot that goes into it, and the role for government, I think, is really where we've traditionally played. Is there a failure, or is there a barrier here that needs to be addressed?
And I think we've built a platform that now the market needs to figure out how to actually build off that platform, both historical investments and new investments, and I think it'll come.
Okay, thank you. So Jason mentioned that life sciences cuts across many segments of government, and he suggested that there's a need for a pan-government strategy. Do you think that that is critical to moving things forward? And how difficult a challenge do you think that's going to be? Is that going to be possible? How long is it going to take? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. Maybe I'll jump in on that one. I think you're actually already starting to see some of that. As with a lot of things in government, it starts slow and takes some time. But even the concept of the mandate letters that you were probably familiar with, the ministerial mandate letters that each of the ministers of the cabinet receive. If you read those, what you'll see is that it's not just you as a minister will deliver these 5, 10 things. It's you, minister, together with your colleagues in these other ministries, will do these things. And that's really been a fundamental change within the Ontario Public Service, in that there's a recognition that we have to work with our colleagues in other ministries. And quite frankly, ministries were fairly siloed entities in past. That's really starting to break down, not just because of the mandate letters, but kind of ongoing interest by the center, cabinet office, premier's office, et cetera. What I can tell you is when you go to Treasury Board now to seek funds, one of their first questions is, have you spoken, who else is coming to the table with you? What other ministry is also being involved here? And I think that hopefully showed up in some of the work we're doing on some of the things I mentioned earlier around cannabis and clean tech and NAFTA and transformative. None of those things are being done by any single ministry. They are being done in collaboration with others. So it's happening. Now, do we have a pan strategy, maybe as the vision laid out? I don't think we're there yet. And the challenge will be, I think actually is one of the first questions this morning identified, focus becomes the question. And there is a inherent built-in challenge within the way our government works, the parliamentary system, which is each of the ministers around the cabinet table represent a certain constituency. So Minister Moridi represents the research and innovation and science community. Minister Dogood represents largely the business community. And you can go, Mr. Hoskins represents hospitals, healthcare workers, and patients largely. So they all have their constituent mandates, if you will, and there are times when those come into conflict. Where you are balancing off, and I think that's where some of the comments come from, which is there's a criticism, at least waged this morning, that governments tend to look at life sciences as basically a cost item. Certainly within the healthcare sector, I don't know if you can say that for the full life sciences sector. That there is a certain element of truth to that, and it is because of the single-payer system we have. But I think there's also a growing desire to work together. Certainly the creation of OCHIS, Bill Chernesky is a recognition of that. Again, are we going to turn this ship overnight? Not likely. And it's going to take a lot of coordination, not just within the OPS, but even between levels of government, particularly the federal government, but even locally.
And to build on Greg's point around the collaboration, Greg and I actually have kind of quarterly, every 2-month meetings with both my deputy and Deputy Nubley at ISED, but also at the ADM level. So all the ADMs, we either fly to Ottawa or they come to Toronto. And so I think, Jason, in the blueprint, the pan-Canadian is a possibility. But I'm not going to bank on it, right? In terms of, I'd rather get going on things like I'd rather see Bill come forward with an SPEC challenge. I'd rather see a challenge around how do we use data out of our ambulances and et cetera. I'd rather you look at the feds. We launched a voucher, and in the next budget they announced a voucher. We launched the Small Business Innovation Challenge, and then they announced that they were going to do one too. So, we're working on an IP strategy and a data strategy, and they're working on one too. So, for sure there has to be coordination of those strategies, and there is coordination of thought. We're doing a thing at the IP roundtable that we had the federal trade commissioners there who are working on NAFTA. So I think that there is a lot more collaboration between the two levels of government. I'm just not going to slow down because we got work to do here in Ontario. And I think it then creates learnings for the feds, because the challenge the feds have is the difference between BC, Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, and the East Coast. And that's a much harder thing to actually pull together.
Thank you very much. Greg, actually, you mentioned the Life Sciences Working Group. We know that it was formed earlier this year, and you said that it was very active. You started talking a little bit about it. We only gave you 5 minutes for everything. So if there's a possibility for either one of you, both of you, to expand and tell us a little bit about the targeted outcome and a little bit about timing around that.
That's probably for me to address. Maybe just step back a little bit. So the Life Sciences Working Group was, again, something driven by Minister Moridi to set up. And he certainly had advice to do something along those lines. What we've actually established with the Life Sciences Working Group is a group of representatives from across the life sciences community. And the purpose here, we tried to balance it a little bit. So we didn't make it a formal group, and this is a little bit of inside government stuff, but they're not a OIC or an ordering council, so it's not a formal group. As soon as you provide advice to administer, you have to go through those formal channels. So it's actually set up such that it's technically advice to the deputy, but that allows us to do a couple of things. It allows us to be more flexible in how we use the advice coming out. And it also allows us to be more supportive as the group works. So we have, and I'm speaking on behalf of the ministry here, we've been trying to be a very supportive secretariat, if you will, for that group, and yet let the working group determine their own agenda, their own vision, where they would like things to go, and the recommendations that they would like to, and the advice that they would like to provide to the deputy on that front. We have, it's actually been quite interesting. In the beginning of the year, there was a lot of time and effort put into, what do we want this to be? What kind of outputs are we looking for? Through this, we kind of landed, or the working group landed on kind of 4 key areas. Not surprisingly, access to capital was one of them. Talent was another. And then they took 2 different views of technology. Technology and innovation creation, but also technology and innovation adoption. So those kind of were the 4 areas that subcommittees, if you will, subgroups were created around. They did their work over the summer. That's been brought back. And interestingly, the group is now, as we sit here speaking, they are looking at, they're going back, if you will, to the original visions and mandate that they saw for themselves, retesting those, if you will, and validating that, and then putting the recommendations that they came up with against that. So I think, as I said earlier, it's getting very close to output time. I'm not really in a position to say what that output's going to be because it's not my output, it's the working group's output. We're simply, as the ministry, there to provide secretariat support and help them come up with that. We have made a commitment that we are going to look very closely at that to build into our own strategies going forward. And again, this is, the timing I think is really good for this. As I mentioned earlier, it's a great time for new ideas to come forward, and we're certainly going to be keen to receive that.
Thank you very much, Greg. So one statistic in particular that jumped out at me when Jason was presenting was in terms of education and talent. And Jason mentioned that we're 25% higher in terms of education than the OECD average. So at the same time, he said those students that come out of university are actually underemployed and that we have a high rate of unemployment in that area. So my question really is, it seems like an underutilized opportunity. Why is this happening? What can we do about it? Sort of what impact do you think it's having, and how do we change that paradigm? Because considering what we're trying to achieve and the resource that we have, there's got to be some shift there, I would think.
So I think that, you're seeing, first of all, our highly skilled workforce is our strength. And we can't take our foot off that. I think the challenge is, for a lot of these young students, and I was a co-op grad myself, is where's that first job and how do they get into the market? So we're working with MAISD, I still call it TCU, around how do we actually, and Jason references in the blueprint, how do we continue to work around that youth job strategy to actually work with our youth to get that first job? The Campus Linked Accelerator model has been hugely successful in terms of the number of startups, as has the entire network. I think that the challenge now, and I'll come back to my scale-up strategy, is where is the company that when it needs the CMO, the head of sales, it needs that kind of, not that entry-level job, but that next level, the 8 to 12 year kind of employee that's been in the industry. Where do we find those to actually help the companies scale? So I think that if as we scale more companies and as we have more successes in this country, you're going to see that pull. But that said, spend a day at Communitech or DMZ or 111 or one of these things, and you'll come away inspired by what these kids are coming up with. So I think kids are saying, if there's not a job, that's fine, I'll just go start a company. And a lot of them will fail, and so they should. But a lot of them will learn a lot, and maybe one will be a Shopify or a League or a Thalmic or a Vidyard or some of the companies that really are scaling. So I think it's wonderful the level of education attainment that we have in our youth, and I think that they're either we're going to make a market for them or they're going to make their own market.
The only thing I would add to that is I think I do think the numbers are somewhat disconcerting, but it's an onion I'd like to peel, I guess, before really kind of going too far in any one direction. John's mentioned one of the areas, I think that may account for some of that, but it is something that, we certainly don't hear from the business community or otherwise that, oh, we've got lots of talent, not a worry. We actually hear kind of the opposite, that, I can't get the talent I need. So there's obviously a disconnect there with either the skills they're coming out of school with, or what the expectations are, or something. But I don't know the answer to it, but I think it's an onion that needs to be peeled.
And I think the Amazon bid really threw a light on the whole talent question. And I think the government's also trying to respond. Somebody did mention earlier on, I don't know if people know this, but the government recently increased the amount of procurement it's going to use locally from 25 to 33%. So the more things that we do around talent, and then the more things we do around trying to build markets, I think the better off this is going to be.
Thank you very much. So we've talked about access to capital. Jason spoke about it. Both of you have spoken about it. Do we still think that that's a challenge? At least from what we hear, I think there's still that challenge that exists. Part of what I hear is awareness or lack of awareness of how to actually get to that point, to get the access to the capital, to get that scale up. And John, you talked about the scale up voucher, which sounds really exciting. It sounds like it's moving things forward. Any other comments in terms of kind of what has to happen next to help this get even bigger, get even broader, and make things happen?
And Brenda and Steve know this better than I do, but you've seen an increase in the number of corporates coming to Canada looking for that discovery. You've seen an increased buzz around places like Mars and others, and I think that the capital markets know that they're there's criticism of the Bayer deal or whatever, but the fact is you have Versant Ventures here that wasn't here 7 or 8 years ago, and it's not just Brad and Cheryl, but Stefan is sitting on the Mars board with me, and Stefan is now left the company that he was with to go back to Versant. So that is an ecosystem, right? Those are players and people that weren't here in 2008. I remember going to Bio in 2008, and literally the entire terminal was empty. I walked on the plane. I think I was the only one on the plane going down to Bio. And now it's a different market, and there's a lot more buzz. And I think you're seeing things like you're seeing that kind of convergence of things like Autodesk with life sciences, et cetera. So I think that the capital will come when the companies come. And I think that we just need to get more and more companies further up market, and that's what things like our voucher and others are aimed at, or even the Small Business Innovation Challenge of actually getting that first reference customer, so that the how many times do you hear I have the Tennessee Valley Authority as a reference customer, but I can't get the Ontario government as a reference customer. So I think the more things that we can get further up market, and the more things that Greg and I and others in the ministry can do to help that, the better off it'll be. Capital will come.
Sounds great. Thank you. So Jason presented a very holistic strategy, at least outlined in terms of what all the components need to be. Is there one, I would say, that you would say either is going to have the greatest impact or is the biggest challenge in terms of helping to move this overall strategy forward? Sorry, that's not on the list.
So I in my mind, I would pick the last pillar, of the four of them, and I did do my homework last night. You know, when you look at the Trade Commissioner Service, when you look at the network and the accelerators we put together, when you look at the data repositories that Jason's referencing, when you look at intellectual property and becoming a first-time adopter in procurement, if I was going to pick up a bucket of the four, I'd gravitate to the last bucket. I think it's where a lot of the meat is. You know, we're doing things like reviewing the one, and we're doing things around access to capital, and with our friends at Maisdy, we'll figure out the talent piece, and even the later stage talent piece, I would say would be equally. So if I was to pick a bucket that I would want to really go at, I would pick the fourth bucket.
As much as I'd like to be controversial here, I would actually agree with John. And part of that is because I think if we get that fourth bucket right, then, you know, the promotion will kind of solve itself. Will become, and we are starting to. There is starting to be a buzz. We're starting to get some of that. The access to capital will follow. You know, those types of things. So, I guess where I really kind of agree with John on this is that's if you don't get that one, the other ones don't matter. Is kind of the way I would approach it.
By the way, I did like the word allow the accelerators to be market driven. I don't think anyone's actually saying that they can't be market driven. So I did pick up on the word allow last night when I was reading it. So they can be market driven as they want to be. Like, go for it. Swing.
Okay, so the one other thing, among many, but one other thing that I picked up on, and we talk a lot about it, just from a business standpoint, is the patient-centered sort of model. And you're talking a lot about it will come. You're talking about the users driving this. So how do we make that link between where the innovation happens, where the access to capital happens, and the patient? Is that sort of innate? Is that just going to happen? How is that link being made? And do you think it's critical to, again, making a success in the life sciences sector?
Yeah, no, I think the link is going to be made. I think that increasingly, and I would be surprised if at some point people don't go back and look at our freedom of information legislation to actually unbundle that, because the user is driving this. And so I think that I think the link is being made, and I think that a lot of the things that are being done are workarounds, both at the hospital level, at the government level, and at the company level. And I think that people are going to figure out their way. I mean, AI and quantum and 5G and sensors and whatever. Like, you know, I'm going to have a sensor that told me I walked into Mount Sinai. I'm actually not going to have to register. I mean, there's already a company where you actually, when you land, it already knows that you've landed, and you can actually walk out of the airport. You don't even have to go through customs. So I think that the technologies are going to be there where, you know, and data is going to drive this. And I think it's just simply going to, we don't even know what we don't know. I mean, there's a saying that technology acceleration is never going to be as slow as it is today. Right, and if you went to Singularity University, the session they had there at Evergreen, I mean, it was incredible. Some of the conversations going on around the kinds and the nature of transformative technology.
The only thing I'd really add to that is, you know, John talked about a kind of the market aspect, if you will, but I can, you know, there are themes that arise within the OPS on occasion, sort of various times. In past, there have been things like, you know, evidence-based decision-making, diversity inclusion. One of the ones that we're seeing now, though, is around design thinking, which really starts with, in the case of healthcare, would start with the patient as you start your design thinking from there. If you're talking the business world, you start with the customer or your government case, clients, whatever. But this is a new a concept that's starting to be raised and driven throughout the OPS as an organization. So I think that will affect that.
Okay. So I think it's time to open up the floor for questions. So I'd like to thank Greg Wootton, John Marshall for sharing their insights and so openly answering all of the questions that I posed. Thank you, and round of applause. Okay, so open up the floor to questions. I believe Brian has a mic that he will bring to you. Oh, Jason has a question. Yeah, is that allowed?
I heard somebody behind me say, "Oh, surprise." First of all, thank you very much to both of you for being so open and frank and answering all of these questions today. I think it's very encouraging to hear all that's happening within the province. I think it's exciting. Certainly times have changed in the gap since I've been with government, so it is great to hear all of these initiatives that are underway. Greg, my question is actually for you. So you and I had a chance to chat informally. I'll get to you, John. Informally at the Ontario Economics Summit earlier this year, and we were talking, and one of the things that we discussed really struck me, and I've been thinking about it for a long time since that conversation. And that was this idea of how within economic development and even across government, we tend to segment, as you said, there's mandates and constituencies, right? There's health, there's economic development. But even within economic development, we think of sectors, right? We think of life sciences, we think of aerospace, on autos, and so forth. But now, and you touched on this briefly, but you didn't get too deep into it, but now we're looking at platform technologies and areas and how they're being incorporated, and they cut across a variety of sectors. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more detail, because that's a fundamental shift in the way we do economic development and the way we think about policies around economic development. So what do you see as some of the big changes coming down the horizon with that mindset and some of the challenges maybe from a policy perspective?
Yeah, and it's a question that I've been, my team as well, have been spending a lot of time on over the past year, which is, are we in a post-sectoral economy? That is, can you actually really address issues on a sectoral basis? And we often use the automotive sector. The automotive sector, we're looking at the advent of autonomous vehicles. Well, is that a manufacturing thing? Is that automotive, or is that an IT thing? You can make arguments that it's as much or more IT based than it is actually the manufacturing side. But autonomous vehicles is not a technology. It's not even really a platform. It's a combination of technologies. It's really an emerging industry. And so one of the things that we've done is we've taken a step back and tried to look at all the various strategies and programs we have and try to remap them. And what we've done is we've taken a look at, we have what we call horizontal strategies or horizontal issues, and those are things like IP and access to capital, regional economic development, and there's a whole host more. And then we're starting to bucket, if you will, the rest of it into kind of three areas: transformative technologies. So that is your artificial intelligence, that is your quantum, that is your 5G, et cetera. Emerging industries, autonomous vehicles being one, but cannabis is an emerging industry as well. And so there are other ones in that space. And then what we're calling traditional industries or foundational industries. So your automotive, your aerospace, your chemical, life sciences. But the challenge, or the challenge for us, and kind of the realization in going through this exercise, is as we look forward, and that's really the key to this, is looking forward. So in other words, let's not do our sector strategies, our technology strategies, looking in the rear view mirror and about trending the last 5 years. In some ways, the world we live in now, the last 5 years really don't matter that much. Yes, you can get a trend, but the speed at which technologies and transformation is happening, that it's really hard to predict. So we're trying to look more forward. We're trying to look at the technologies and what their impacts will be, not just on the economic side, but even including things like job dislocation and so societal impacts, et cetera. It's really, and we've started having conversations with other ministries around these types of things. Have you thought about what this means when there are no more, the job classification of trucker really doesn't exist anymore, or radiologist, or, you know, there's a whole host of things. So we are starting to really take a different view of this, and the good news that I would say about this, it's being driven from the top. So the Secretary of Cabinet is very, you know, it's really being driven from him at his level, to the extent that we were actually directed to institute kind of a new role that I have the pleasure of overseeing, which is the Disruptive Technologies Unit. And this is a group of folks that all they do, we call them tech scouts, or tech chasers. We just want them kind of on the leading edge of what's happening, and then bring that back and try and distill, what does that mean? Is this a replacement technology? So in other words, will it replace an old technology? Or will it be complementary to existing technologies? Or is it brand new altogether and, you know, we'll have it's just brand new. So there's different ways of looking at this, and we're taking kind of a whole different way. So when you ask about the impact, it's pretty substantial. The challenge for us now is the structure of the organization is built around the old way of thinking. I had someone years ago tell me that if you look at the way government is structured, if you were the leading industry a century ago, you have a ministry. If you were the leading industry of the 20th century, you might have a department. If you're the leading industry of the 21st century, you'd be lucky if you have one analyst on your file. So anyway.
Other questions? I'm going to pick the person who has the microphone closest to them for now.
Maybe.
Oh, you have one too? I didn't see that. Okay, sorry.
It's just a follow-up to that comment. So maybe I can just. So while I appreciate changing structure of government, which is actually what we're asking to a certain extent, even the comment you just made about bucketing things in transformative, emerging, traditional, and maybe life science fits in traditional, I would argue that mining genomic science could be transformative. It uses AI. It's also an emerging industry, and it's not just developing rational design of drugs or using a drone to find a chemical sensor in a field in order to determine whether you know what you need to do in terms of fertilization. So I'm not sure you can even bucket them the way you're bucketing them, even though I appreciate that you're trying to change things. And what I worry about is that you still mentioned, where's the limit? Where's the sides? Well, you know, I would argue that perhaps there isn't, and it's looking at a whole new way of looking at science across those ministries, which perhaps the chief scientist could look at, but how you evaluate those technologies in life science, because, you know, I don't work with any life science company now that doesn't have an engineer, a biologist, a mathematician, a physicist, et cetera, et cetera. So I still worry about the bucketing issue, understanding the problem about government. So just a comment, maybe?
Yep, I mean, I think what Greg outlined, Greg's spinach example was a good one, right? Like, you know, where does that play? Where does that stop? I was in Ottawa at SDTC the other night, and the person who's running a $90 billion refinery, he's all got sensors everywhere, right? I mean, it's changing the way that we do traditional mining. And so I think that what the deputy has done is tried to actually take us out of our small business, entrepreneurship, access to capital, commercialization, and put us into bigger, broader sets of platforms, if you want, strategy and disruptive technology, commercialization. Bill Mantel's working on transformative tech to try to actually get us out of our traditional silos, but we still do have a problem in the parliamentary system where you have a Minister of Health, and it's actually difficult for us because Greg and I often have to navigate whose file is it, who actually signs off on the decision because of the parliamentary system. So I think the parliamentary system is actually clashing against the way the business is being done. I mean, my question back to the audience would be, how is the life sciences industry changing? What is a life sciences company today, and how different is it, and is it keeping up with the business model around the spinach example that Greg walked through? So as a life sciences company today, able to deal with the kind of what would be, we're a vaccine company, or we're a therapeutic company, or we're a device company, how are actually life sciences companies actually define their own market? Because I think that's as big a challenge as it is for us to actually fix our parliamentary system in this complex world.
I think we had a question over here.
Yeah, a question for Greg specifically. You had mentioned a number of areas are being evaluated, I think shreds and IP. On IP, I've observed that, let me preface this, a key success factor for an inventor who happens to reside in a hospital as a physician or university or research, and deflator occurs because in negotiations of the ownership of the IP, the intellectual property person, institution takes a majority or takes a large share of the company. And that becomes a deflator. In fact, I know one situation where the inventor said, I'll walk away from this. Recently at JLabs, there was an excellent presentation on the range of ownerships that takes place. And in Canada, it was extremely high across the various hospitals and institutions. And I see that as a deflator to innovation. I wondered if, in the scope of your evaluation, will you be taking that into consideration?
We're certainly, excuse me, we're certainly aware of kind of that outstanding issue, and it was actually something flagged by the Auditor General in her IP. She looked at IP treatment in universities, et cetera, and it was flagged there. I go back though to the jurisdictional part. We are aware of it, and it's something that we're certainly looking at, and we want to put into our broader strategy. Challenge on that, and actually a number of other fronts when it comes to IP, is the province actually has no jurisdiction. So it's not, we can't insert ourselves in there and say, this is the way it's got to be. Actually, most universities, research institutions, the IP treatment is actually embedded in the collective agreement. So you can imagine what the appetite is for government to stick itself into the collective agreement. So there are some limitations there, but we are actively looking at, what does this mean? What are the impacts? Are there things that we can, even when it comes to our own programs? So JPF, for example, the Jobs Prosperity Fund, will fund R&D. Are we treating it properly as part of those programs? If we start providing funding to smaller companies, should we ensure that they have an IP strategy within their company as one of their first things? And maybe that's something that the vouchers can help address, et cetera. So we're looking at a broad range of things, but the recognition is that one of the challenges we as the province have is that we don't have a lot of levers here.
And from my standpoint, we're actually, IP now and data are very commingled. Someone will give you this device, provided they can have all the data off the device that you actually give them. So the device is free, right? But give me all the data. And so I think the whole issue around data and data ownership means, so one is called the enterprise, and then one is the data. So can you protect the enterprise and the idea that you have, but then also, can you actually have the data? Because if Google and Facebook and Amazon are going to charge you for the data, then likely your enterprise isn't going to make any money. So we actually need to look at both those things, and Greg's right. Like, I mean, we're looking at an IP voucher right now to actually help companies at a scale-up stage deal with their IP regime, to actually help them actually, you know, get the coaching and the strategies that they need to do that. We're working with the Standards Council of Canada around how can we actually utilize standards to drive markets. So we have a lot of things that we're doing both on the IP side as well as my scale-up strategy to try to figure out what are those key levers that we can pull at a provincial level to actually deal with that. But IP is one, and actually data would be second to that.
A follow-up. I'm very glad to hear about this IP voucher, because I've seen a number of examples where the inventor runs out of money, or the intellectual property doesn't want to put the money forward to get patents in other jurisdictions outside of Canada or the United States. And then fast forward, all of a sudden that becomes a disadvantage in raising money. So yeah, thank you very much for pushing that IP voucher idea.
So I think we could probably talk about this for a longer time, another hour or two. I see Jason nodding at me that time is up, so unfortunately we cannot take any more questions. Once again, want to thank Greg and John for your time, for your insights, for your transparency. Very much appreciated, and a very, very interesting conversation and information that you provided.